Jews are fleeing Britain and Europe for Israel and America, to the extent to where senior Trump administration officials are proposing offering British Jews asylum in the United States from the impacts of mass migration and the Labour government's unwillingness to address the pro-Palestine mobs that they would like to appease. And the reason I'm making this video is twofold. First of all, because the reported number of Jews living in Britain is just not accurate. I've spoken to people who are in the community and in the know and are concerned about this sort of thing, and they've said that the number is falling below 100,000, that people are making their plans to leave, especially in light of both the Bondi Beach shooting in Sydney in Australia, but especially the Manchester synagogue shooting on Yom Kippur last October. And they've been doing so for a while, and it's not just because of the exorbitant tax rates imposed upon productive people by the current Labour government. It's because of the demographic composition of the country, where by 2063, white Brits, indigenous Brits, will be a minority in their own homeland, and the Muslim demographic will be about a quarter of the country. And there are lots of Jews who recognise that they just can't live under those conditions. But the other reason I'm making this video is because there are still some Jews who believe that a ethnically heterogeneous, multicultural melting pot, or even a largely Muslim nation, would be preferable to live in than a white European Christian one. And I'm sorry, there are an increasing number of Jews, as well as we indigenous Europeans and Brits, who recognise that that's just not going to happen, I'm afraid. We're just not going to stand for that, no matter what names we're going to be called, because it gets too many people killed, Jews and whites alike. Now, the Trump administration recognises this. Trump's personal lawyer, this is Robert Garson, he was born in Manchester, he himself is Jewish, has spoken to the State Department about providing sanctuary for Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in Britain. He said the UK is no longer a safe place for Jews. Speaking to The Telegraph, Garson said he could see no future for Jews in the UK and laid much of the blame on Sir Keir Starmer for allowing anti-Semitism to flourish. Reminder, Keir Starmer's own family is Jewish, his wife is Jewish, his kids are Jewish. He has made repeated overtures to the Jewish community, but also the Muslim community. His friend, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, is Jewish. His friend Philippe Sands, the universalist human rights lawyer, is also Jewish. But they are left-wing Jews, they are liberals, they are ideological socialists, and you now have right-wing Jews, expats from the UK, but also people in the US and Israel, criticising them, saying, no, we are a distinct ethnic group with a religious tradition that doesn't get along with other ethnic groups and can get along with other ethnic groups and religions, namely white European Christians and heritage Americans, far better. And so you are engaging in a civilizational suicide pact that will end in the death of our people, as well as the ethnicities that we can get along with, namely mine. He raised the idea of offering the US as a safe haven to British Jews with Mr. Trump's anti-Semitism czar in his capacity as a board member of the US Holocaust Memorial Council. Trump appointed Garson to the council last May after firing the board members appointed by Joe Biden. Those board members sustained serious criticism from the Israeli government for being too willing to liaise with Muslim groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations just last week. So there is a lot of animosity towards pro-Muslim left-wing Jews by the international right-wing Jewish diaspora, who are starting to realise their only chance at survival is to make common cause with the ethnically self-conscious native populations of Europe and white Christians in America and Australia. Rabbi Yehuda Kaplan in Florida took up office as the president's special envoy combating anti-Semitism in December. He now works out of the State Department as an ambassador. Garson said the UK is no longer a safe place for Jews. I have spoken to the State Department as to whether the president should be offering British Jews asylum in the US. It is certainly not an unattractive proposition. It is a highly educated community. I've spoken to the people in the State Department, and I've mentioned it in my role on the Holocaust Museum Board. It's a populace that speaks English natively, that is educated and doesn't have a high proportion of criminals. There were conversations. when I look at what's going on with Jews in Britain and when I look at the changing demographics, I don't believe, and I have discussed this with people in the Trump administration, that there is a future for Jews in the United Kingdom. For me, that is particularly sad, and I must say, from people that I've spoken to, that is a common sentiment. It is fearful, but also mournful of having to leave a country where their ancestors have settled for, in some cases, a few hundred years, and where they lived alongside in relative peace and prosperity, and whose individual families did nothing to contribute to the incoherent ethno-cultural makeup of Britain today, which puts both Jews, but also, importantly, its native population at risk. Keir Starmer has turned a total blind eye to anti-Semitism. Garson said, the Prime Minister has allowed rampant anti-Semitism to become commonplace in society and has allowed it to come from those who really don't have Britain's best interests at heart. I'd like to translate that a little bit. He has also allowed anti-white hatred to run rampant, as have successive Prime Ministers and civil servants, and this is done by people who never needed to be here in the first place. Remigration solves this issue. The repeal of anti-white equalities and diversity legislation solves this. And if Jews do want a future in Britain, that's the only horse to ride to victory. Mark my words, Garson said, they're coming for the Jews and then they're coming for your pubs. You're going to have Sharia-compliant areas very, very soon. Well, it's already happening. And so, rather than warning about it happening, we just have to start reversing the situation. And this is a warning that has also been extolled by Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism. That's Amichai Chikli, the same chap who invited Tommy Robinson on a state visit to Israel last year. Chikli said to the Daily Mail in June of 2025, British Jews should leave the UK unless the government changes and the Labour Party is responsible for fueling anti-Semitism across the country. Without a dramatic change of course by Britain's political leadership, I see no future for Jewish life in England. My recommendation to Jews in the UK, as well as to those living in Belgium, is to consider leaving and make aliyah to the land of Israel. Now, Jews have an Israel of their own. This is a point that I made in an earlier article, which then Douglas Murray recently echoed in his interview with the New Culture Forum. But as the protagonist in Welbeck's Submission tells his Jewish girlfriend, who is fleeing France, which has been dominated by Islam in this not-so-fictional dystopian novel, for Israel, well, he laments, there is no Israel for me. There is no Israel for us, the indigenous white populations of Britain and Europe. And so the only way that Jews can live in these countries, where their ancestors have lived for a few hundred years, is if we regain possession of our countries again as self-conscious, ethno-cultural and religious groups. The only way that Jews can live in Britain is if indigenous, native Brits enjoy the same status in their country as Jews do in Israel. Fortunately, there are an increasing number of Jews who support this, but unfortunately, there are just as many prominent Jewish voices who support the complete opposite. At the World Economic Forum last week, the president of the Conference of European Rabbis, that is Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, sat alongside Sheikh Mohammed Al-Issa, who is the Secretary General of the Muslim World League and the chairman of the Muslim Scholars Association, on an interfaith dialogue panel, which tellingly featured no Christians, and said that Muslims and Jews need to ally to fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from the far right, led by old Europeans, which is just a slur implying that native white European populations are antiquated and should be substituted for a population which is less Islamophobic and anti-Semitic.
Your Eminence, especially in Germany, you are facing a rise of anti-Semitism, but we are facing this all over the world. So I would like to hear what is your perspective on this.
The 7th of October has created turbulence in the whole world, a tremendous rise of anti-Semitism, organized, state-sponsored, in many instances, in universities, on the streets, and a rise of 500%, maybe some instances to 1,000% of anti-Semitic acts. And there has also been a reaction of Europe. I think the rise of the extreme right in many European countries is a response to the insecurity felt by the old Europeans, so-called old Europeans, regarding the new immigrants who came from the Middle East. So I think that fighting Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is an interest of both religions and both communities, and when we do it together, it's going to be much more useful. We have created, under also the Saudi umbrella, more than 10 years ago, the Muslim Jewish Leadership Council, and which was successful. And we believe that we have to go this way if we want to make sure that every European can live in peace and walk in peace in the streets.
This is not only delusional, because no, not every European can live in peace and walk in peace in the streets if you import completely incompatible traditions, peoples, cultures, religious practices to live cheek by jowl with one another when resources are scarce as well. But also, it's a particularly insidious denial of the indigeneity of European peoples by calling them the so-called old Europeans, not only implying that new Europeans have come in and taken up the European identity and are therefore as European as those whose ancestors trace back thousands of years to the Germanic tribes that Tacitus wrote about, but also that so-called implies their claim to indigeneity is not even real in the first place. So not only are they the old Europeans who are outmoded compared to the new, progressive, vibrant new Europeans, but are they even really European at all? Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. This is the same Rabbi Goldschmidt, by the way, who in 2017 did the same. He called for solidarity between Muslims and Jews. He said, where there is tolerance for other languages, other cultures, religions, traditions, we Jews feel more accepted. Jews always felt more comfortable in places where other cultures and religions were respected. At the moment when an ultra-nationalist wind begins to blow, it makes Jews as a minority uncomfortable. Europe was heading into a period of fluidity and turbulence, which raises the question, to what extent can you ensure the continuity of the Jewish community in Europe, he said. A new mood of hostility to minority religions was being fueled by fears over immigration and terrorism. You know what causes those? All the terror attacks. The crimes committed by the new immigrants, who didn't need to be here. Instead, the rabbi insists that they do, and that you're a racist for complaining about it. Quote, in general, what we see is a reaction to immigration from the Middle East, which has brought millions of Muslims to Europe. Europe is now engaging in anti-immigration measures and dealing with the fear of Islamic terrorism. But instead of engaging with the problems, there is a strong attack against minority religions in general. We, Jews and Muslims, definitely have a common cause in fighting for religious freedoms. If you don't take the side of indigenous white Europeans, and instead you side with the community that generates a disproportionate number of sex criminals and murderers and jihadists, who then go and kill Jews, then people are going to think that you are their enemy. And so, their backlash to you is then going to be characterized as anti-Semitism, when instead they're just criticizing you for your delusional, liberal, utopian, egalitarian ideas that seem to get Jews and whites killed alike. You're trying to build a Tower of Babel. See the Old Testament as to why that didn't work out. As we'll see later, Rabbi Goldschmidt insists that he's being taken out of context, but he's been saying this now for almost 9 years. If not the Bondi Beach massacre, if not the Manchester synagogue shooting, if not October the 7th, if not all of the terror attacks committed in Europe at Christmas markets, the Bataclan massacre, the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, the Manchester Arena bombing, the London Bridge attack, the Westminster Bridge attack, Lee Rigby's murder. If not all of those attacks, then what will get you to reassess your ethnocidal insistence, Rabbi, that Jews and Muslims can get along? That the true threat to Jews is the white European Christian populations who are committing precisely 0 terror attacks against them. How many more dead Jews, how many more dead white children will it take for you to change your mind? And if there isn't a limit on that, then I must say, to the sensible Jews out there who have not only called this out, but I know do watch my stuff because they care about the demographic composition of our country and ensuring that it remains English, that America remains American, that Europe remains European, you've got to do all you can to ensure that crazy people like this stop leading our civilization into ruin. This guy should not have any position of power within the Jewish community because he wishes to do your community and mine serious harm. Now, this has been condemned by Trump's anti-Semitism envoy, it's Rabbi Yehuda Kaplan, saying blaming old Europe for the present surge in anti-Semitism is disgraceful. I am proud to serve in an administration that understands that mass migration is a huge driver of anti-Semitism. It creates dramatic social changes and threatens the safety of all citizens. This administration, led by President Trump and Secretary Rubio, recognize and confront today's challenges with clarity. Mass migration itself threatens the safety of Jews and all communities. And in a broader national security document and various press statements released by the State Department, they also say that white European flight from their cities, from their ancestral homelands, is itself a human rights violation. So, whereas the ambassador here speaks about mass migration as a threat to Jews, the broader State Department and Trump administration recognizes mass migration as a civilizational, existential threat to white Europeans and the culture, religion, and tradition that Americans share with them. Goldschmidt responded to the ambassador, saying this is a blatant misquote aimed to further hate against Jews in Europe. I never blamed old Europe for the current rise in anti-Semitism. I clearly pointed to the surge in jihadist attacks and noted that anti-Semitism comes from both the far right, far left, and radical Islam. Okay, well, you can't say both because you said three things there. But also, no, you didn't. We all saw the clip, and I'm sorry, you can't claim that the ambassador fighting anti-Semitism, a rabbi, is deliberately misquoting you to cause a rise in hatred against Jewish people. Nobody is buying this anymore. Not plenty of Jews in Israel who are confused as to why Europe, America, Britain have admitted so many jihadists, which they don't want in their country, but also many patriotic Americans, Brits, white Europeans, who are just sick to death of not being allowed a country because you call them racist and anti-Semitic for saying, hey, funnily enough, none of these foreign criminals or people demographically and culturally terraforming my ancestral homeland need to be here. They all have homes of their own that they can go to. None of them are buying this boy who cried wolf routine. We're not being called names anymore. The magic spells don't work. We do not want to have you browbeat us with the spectres of the 20th century and forming some sort of resentful pact with Muslims who are more likely to kill you and me. We're not going to stand for it. Also, Goldschmidt has always been against the US administration. He said, with the victory of Trump, we have ultra-nationalist parties feeling invigorated and strengthened, and they hope to have more influence in European politics. So it's important to retain European common values and European unity. If we say every country is on its own, and we're all looking out for the interests of our own country, the European Union has been a failed project, and we could go back to 1914. Yes, the European Union has been a failed project because it's demographically swamped Europeans with people who are wholly incompatible with their traditions, with their culture. They don't even speak the same language. They don't even share the same alphabet. And so, this results in violent crime, an identity crisis. And so to say that President Trump is the real threat, the far right among old Europeans are the real threat, is insulting and deluded. Now, why does the rabbi think this way? Well, I've turned to Jewish authors to try to explain this. Firstly, Eric Kaufman's White Shift provides a summary of how left modernist, liberal, pro-immigration politics, summed up by phrases like the melting pot or the Anti-Defamation League's book A Nation of Immigrants, came to being in America in the early 20th century. And he writes that liberal progressives were the first recognizably modern left-liberal open borders movement. They combined aspects of individualist anarchism, ecumenism, and progressivism into a new synthesis. Two intellectual traditions nourished liberal progressivism, both Anglo-American anarchism and secularized Reform Judaism. The former was represented in the persona of William James, and the second by Felix Adler. And then he speaks about Adler's work. Where Reformed Jewish theology called for Jews to work to unite the world's peoples under monotheism, Adler went further, suggesting Jews should dissolve themselves once the task was finished. The perpetuity of the Jewish race depends upon the perpetuity of the Jewish religion. So long as there shall be a reason of existence for Judaism, so long the individual Jews will keep apart and will do well to do so. When this process of evangelization is accomplished, the individual members of the Jewish race will look about them and perceive that there is as great and possibly greater liberty in religion beyond the pale of their race, and will lose their peculiar idiosyncrasies, and their distinctiveness will fade, and eventually the Jewish race will die. Adler's ideas naturally went down like a lead balloon among Jews, but James and other anarcho-pluralists applauded. So the idea is that Jews as a minority, as the only minority in predominantly white European Christian nations, stick out like a sore thumb, and because of a history of persecution and expulsions and scapegoating, they are concerned about becoming a persecuted minority and banished from said lands. So, a survival strategy is to create a universalist, pluralist, multi-ethnic, multicultural country in which it's a mosaic of different minorities, all competing along group lines for shared resources and recognition. And eventually, if you believe in blank slate anthropology, that we're all equal deep down, that all racial and cultural differences are purely cosmetic, that all inequalities can be remedied by the state, then multiculturalism, mass migration, the mosaic, the melting pot, these are all just transition stages to a place where we will suddenly all realize our equality. There will be no division, there will be no racism, there will be no one group sticking out as different from one another, and so there will be no possibility for groups to be persecuted, for minorities to be persecuted by majorities, for Jews to be persecuted by white Christians, even if this comes at the expense of the abolition of Jewish identity in this liberal universalist milieu. The other reason, and Rabbi Goldschmidt seems like a learned man of Jewish history, could be, as S.D. Goitin, no, I'm not making that name up, wrote in his 1970s book, Jews and Arabs, that Jews see their history, their language, the juridical traditions of both the Talmud, Torah, and Hadiths as being far closer to one another than that of white Christians. And so Muslims actually make for better allies, and, in a certain reading of history, Judaism flourished while living under the jizya as a minority in Muslim lands as dhimmis, capable of retaining and practicing and refining even their own traditions in the Middle East, compared to persecution or certain concessions made in order to live in white Christian Europe as a migrant diaspora. In Goitin's book, he writes about the Jewish people living in Arabia in the time of Islamic dominance, concerning the fateful events and developments which took place at that time during the three most decisive decades of Oriental history, 615 to 645 AD. Not a single contemporary account has come down to us from Jewish sources. While we learn about Jewish-Arab relations in ancient times solely from Jewish and non-Arab sources, we derive all our knowledge concerning these relations in the time of their prophet Muhammad and the subsequent early period of Islam, either from explicit statements or the inner evidence contained in Arab Muslim books. So, a lot of Jewish history is told by Arab Muslim sources. Nevertheless, even this one-sided source of information shows fully the great importance of Judaism, both for the development of religious, moral, and legal conceptions in the Quran, the sacred book of Muslims, in early Islam, and for the formation of the young Muslim community and state. This is a very enlightening passage written by a Jewish author. It has often been stressed by prominent scholars, for example, Theodor Noldeke, the great German Orientalist, that Islam was far more akin to Judaism in its basic ideas, as well as in the details regulating the lives of its believers, than Christianity, despite the closer family relations between Christianity and its mother religion. This opinion, although requiring some qualifications, is basically true. The Muslim religious law in particular, which is the very core of Islam, as the halakha is of Judaism, bears a most astonishing resemblance to the Jewish religious law, its older sister. To what extent these phenomena betray parallel developments or are borrowed will be discussed in a later chapter. In any case, they did not fail to exercise a deep influence on Jewish-Arab relations in Islamic times. It shouldn't be surprising, as Tom Holland's written about in the Shadow of the Sword, some of those who wrote the hadiths were actually ex-rabbis who converted to Islam. So the rabbinical tradition transferred over to Islam because both Jews and Muslims were living as tribes in the same area over the same centuries. With the great Arab conquests, Goitin writes, following the rise of Islam, which converted all the countries between Spain and Persia into a single territory dominated by the new religion, and soon after by the Arabic language as well, the majority of the Jewish people of that time came under Arab rule. Thus began the long and great period of Jewish-Arab symbiosis. The Jewish historians of the 19th century, as in the case of Graetz, the author of a classic 10-volume history of the Jews, who were deeply embittered by the contrast between the enlightened ideas of that century and the denial of civic rights to Jews in many European countries, pointed out most emphatically that the legal and actual position of the Jews during the Middle Ages was much better in Muslim Arab countries than in Christian Europe, and the golden age of Judaism in Muslim Spain has become a phase which has found its way even into the most popular accounts of Jewish history. So there are some scholars, some rabbis, possibly, who believe that living under Muslim rule is more beneficial to Jews than the perceived hypocrisy of white Christian universalism, who throughout the Middle Ages were purportedly far harsher to Jews than Arab Muslim rulers. So this might be the mentality behind why, despite Muslims killing Jews in terror attacks, some influential Jews continue to push the idea that a Jewish-Muslim alliance is preferable to a self-conscious, ethnically homogeneous Christian Europe. Goitin wrote, "As we shall see, there is some exaggeration in these assertions. However, there can be no doubt that the legal status of the Jewish religion under Islam, particularly during its early period when the Arabs were still predominant, was very much better than their situation in the Byzantine Empire, which ruled over many territories and countries occupied later on by the Arabs. In addition to a more favorable legal status, the Jewish people in early Islamic times enjoyed a complete economic and social revival to which, however, the Arab contribution was indirect." He explains the transition from the majority of people being involved in agricultural manual labor to then Jews becoming influential merchants, traders, moneylenders. And he says, the Jews took their full share in this great Middle Eastern mercantile civilization, in particular from the 10th to the 13th centuries. And it was at this time and in that part of the world that Judaism itself received its final shape. There, under Arab-Muslim influence, Jewish thought and philosophy, and even Jewish law and religious practice, were systematized and finally formulated. Even the Hebrew language developed its grammar and vocabulary on the model of the Arab language. The revival of Hebrew in our times with the nation-state of Israel would be entirely unthinkable without the services rendered to it by Arabic in various ways 1,000 years ago. Arabic itself became a Jewish language and, unlike Latin in Europe, was employed by Jews for all secular and religious purposes, with the sole exception of the synagogue service. So there is a certain reading of history which says Jews, perhaps today, would do better under Arab-Muslim rule than living alongside empowered white Europeans in their own countries, despite the murder of Jews in terror attacks by Islamic jihadists. This is insane, but it does explain some of the civilizationally suicidal mentality espoused by Rabbi Goldschmidt and Jewish leftists. We all remember when Danny went on LBC after the Bondi Beach massacre and said that Muslims and Jews need to unite against Nick Fuentes because he's coming for you too.
A conspiracy theory that thinks that the United States has been manipulated into foreign wars by a small elite, as it happens Jewish, is one that sort of denies the whole process of liberal democracy, and it might do the same in this country. And it's also that kind of disrespect for one ethnic group will apply to others, even if they don't like Jews. So for Muslims who don't like, some of whom don't like Jews, a proportion of whom don't like Jews, this will visit them, probably has visited them. And so people like Nick Fuentes, who are coming for me, are coming for all of you.
No, they're not, Danny. And you're insane. If the Bondi Beach massacre causing you to feel too unsafe to light your Hanukkah candles was not a moment for reflection, then there is nothing that will cause you to revisit your liberal priors, which led to you, as a scion of the Conservative Party, advising a liberal migration policy, which led to the importing of the Muslims, the likes of Jihad al-Shami, who committed the Manchester synagogue attack, which has now endangered both Jews and whites like me alike. And it's for this reason, this delusion, that my discussion with Danny Finkelstein has concluded. It ended as expected. Danny wrote an odious Times piece in the last week, not actually arguing with the substance of Danny Kruger or James Orr's post-liberal philosophy, but instead calling people names and saying that nobody within Reform UK can actually get along. And he cited the example of Douglas Carswell and Nigel Farage apparently falling out around 2014. Well, a decade later, Carswell posted an image of himself and Farage in Washington, D.C. about a week or so ago. And I said, "Are you implying Lord Finkelstein is not a paragon of political acumen, Douglas? Must be because you're a racist." Danny, who I didn't even tag, said, "I think you'd be a racist if you tried, in pursuit of ethnic purity, deporting everyone whose grandparents weren't born in the country. You wouldn't be a racist for disputing my abilities." Okay, well, I've never said that, have I, Danny? So yet again, you're just inventing the phantoms of the 20th century, reincarnated as apparently me to become straw men that you can more easily argue against rather than addressing the substance of my point, which is, if you support the model of nation-state enjoyed by Jews in Israel, which needs to exist to keep them safe, then, at the same time, can the indigenous populations of the United Kingdom also enjoy that same model of nation-state to not just keep themselves safe, but also Jews like you? No? Okay, you call me a racist for doing that. And people will not put up with that double standard that endangers both Jews and whites alike. So I responded to Danny, saying, "Danny, it's mad how much time you've spent in the last month getting upset about things I've never said. You're a lord, a millionaire, and a father, and yet you're sat on this website all day talking like I'm the second coming of Adolf Hitler. Log off, it's healthier." And he responded, "I am not a millionaire, not all Jews are." Well, I didn't say that, did I, Danny? And I am sorry if I presumed that the successful author, advisor to multiple Conservative prime ministers and party leaders, was a millionaire. Now, I would wager your net worth is probably well over $1 million, but I'm sorry that you don't have a vault of Scrooge McDuck coins lying around, pallets of cash to lay on like you're a Breaking Bad character. I'm sorry if I insinuated that you were far more successful than you actually are. My bad. Anyway, he continues, "If you make long, inaccurate videos and tweets about me, making up my views, which you just did even now when you made up a suggestion that I think of you as Adolf Hitler, which is offensive as well as absurd," that was the insinuation. I've never been inaccurate about your views, Danny. I've actually just quoted verbatim from your posts and articles, but hey-ho. "Then don't assume I won't respond. I will, because your politics is dangerous and wrong, and I don't think people like me should yield the space to you." So I responded to Danny, and this was the final part of the exchange. "Not all Jews are." Alright, just didn't say that, did I? You're either unhinged or really bad faith. As I said, I presumed that the Lord Baron, OBE, Chelsea Football Club director, author and columnist might have a few 100,000 more in the bank than me, my bad. Now you've cleared that up, would you care to retract all the times you've uncharitably, carelessly mischaracterized mine and others' positions? As for the tweets and videos being inaccurate, you've always been welcome to refute my critiques of your arguments, which I've read verbatim on camera, or even take up the offer of a recorded discussion. But you've always chosen to insult and willfully misinterpret me instead. It's tiresome. And despite saying he didn't want to yield the space to me, he then blocked me, which I suppose is a badge of honor. But this is the point. Rabbi Goldschmidt, Danny Finkelstein, left-wing Jews, who think that for some reason Muslims are more reliable allies than white Christian Europeans, despite Muslims killing you in terror attacks, you are unpopular among an increasing number of Jews, but also white Europeans and Americans and Brits, because your delusions are getting people killed. We can't afford to entertain them anymore. You being afraid of the phantoms of the 20th century are in direct contrast to the murderous hatred, anti-white racism and anti-Semitism alike, exhibited by people imported into our civilizations under the guise of fulfilling the promise of never again. Your politics have led to people dying who never needed to be killed. And so, if you're not willing to reassess your priors which led us all to this point, then we're just going to ignore you. We're not going to care when you call us names. We're going to keep ourselves and our friends safe, whether you like it or not. But the longer that the Jewish community continues to give space to people like Danny Finkelstein or Rabbi Goldschmidt, then the more Jews will flee Europe and the UK for safer pastures in the United States and in Israel. So this is a message to patriotic Jews. Please do all you can to get the people leading your flock astray out of positions of power, because I am not keen to join Danny Finkelstein or Rabbi Goldschmidt in a civilizational suicide pact, and neither will the US State Department. Undersecretary Rogers has been very active on X and in interviews condemning the censorship of European majority populations and the heritage populations of Australia and America in, for instance, the hate speech laws that have been passed hurriedly after the Bondi Beach massacre. She has pointed out that under the auspices of combating anti-Semitism, complaints against mass migration are going to land white Australian patriots in prison. So it's not going to stop the jihadist attacks, which never need to happen, because Australia has never had a history of Islam. It has always been an Anglo-Celtic Christian country, and they've learned, through great difficulty, of course, to live alongside the Aborigines, whose physical land it is, but who didn't establish the Australian state. But any presence of Islam in Australia is an option. Any of the violence caused by a jihadist never needs to happen. And so censoring the people pointing that out is not going to solve the problem. And this is something that Secretary Rogers, Rabbi Kaploun, and the broader State Department and Trump administration all recognize. We're just not putting up with it anymore. Rogers also condemned the banning of Ava Dingerbrook from Britain. She was denied a visa to visit the UK because the Home Office said that her presence is not conducive to the public good. Meanwhile, they worked day and night to import El Fattah, the Egyptian terror sympathizer, from an Egyptian prison into Britain, despite his decades of posting on X how he hates white people, hates Jews, supports the rape of white women, and wants the Taliban or Iran to work on a nuclear program to kill whites. Rogers also intervened when Keir Starmer refused to ban cousin marriage, because it turns out, as I posted on X and that Elon Musk liked, NATO aren't spending money on defending Europe and the UK if it fills itself up with consanguineous, low IQ Pakistani jihadists and Somalian scammers. Rogers shared a video on X of Starmer refusing to support a ban on cousin marriage, captioned, "I've received some questions about what we mean in our national security strategy when we invoke civilizational concerns, so I'm tweeting a relevant news item. To the United States, Muslim levels of cousin marriage, the presence of Muslim clans that practice cousin marriage in Europe, is a civilizational concern. It is a demographic they do not want to grow, and it is something that we should both outlaw and expatriate back to the lands that they belong in." Rogers continued, "Since we know the British government wants to make sure women are safe both online and offline, thus contemplating a Russia-style X-ban to protect them from bikini images invented by Grok, here's more from Wikipedia on cousin marriage and its connection to honor killing. The Trump administration aren't pulling back on this. Islam doesn't belong here. Mass migration from anywhere is a demographic threat to the native populations of Europe and Britain. And the administration is not tolerating nonsense from Rabbi Goldschmidt that says Jews should actually unite with Muslims against the old Europeans and the far right who just want to preserve the demographics and the culture of their countries for them, their children, and their posterity. And I don't know about you, but I'm not tolerating it either, and I don't care what names I get called.